So today, we're going to dig into the very unusual strategy behind Matt Walsh's latest documentary on race. He recently broke down his playbook in a conversation with Jordan Peterson, and trust me, it's not what you'd expect. Let's jump in.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If you had to make a documentary about race in America, where would you even begin? I mean, it is a massive, incredibly complex topic. Well, filmmaker Matt Walsh took on that exact challenge, and his approach was definitely one of a kind. You might remember Matt Walsh from his film, What is a Woman? Well, after that, he set his sights on another huge cultural subject, race. But he knew right away he couldn't just run the same playbook. He needed a completely new angle for this one.
So what was this new strategy? Well, he decided to completely flip the script. Instead of playing the part of the skeptic, asking all the tough questions, he would become a believer, a naive investigator ready to accept everything he was told.
Yeah, so think back to What is a Woman? Walsh's whole thing was being this persistent skeptic, right? Just a blank slate asking questions. But for this new film, a total 180. He decided to play the part of a willing convert, someone who would take every answer as the absolute truth.
And this approach boiled down to a simple three-step method. First, he'd go to the DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion experts, and ask for their guidance. Second, he'd accept their answers, no questions asked. And then, and this is the most important part, he'd actually put their teachings into practice, right there on camera.
You know, this wasn't some tightly scripted documentary. Because of this approach, the film's direction was always changing based on who they talked to. As Walsh put it, we kind of let the story guide us and went down the rabbit hole that way. And that rabbit hole? It ended up being a year-long journey.
Okay, so that's the strategy, but how did it actually play out in the real world?
Well, according to Walsh, getting inside what he calls the DEI bubble was shockingly easy. And just to give you an idea of how easy he claims it was, Walsh says it took him only 30 minutes to get DEI certified online. Yeah, 30. His point is that this isn't some field with super rigorous standards, it's one where almost anyone can just show up and claim to be an expert.
So what's the deal here? Why was it so simple to gain access? Walsh's theory is that these experts exist in an ideological bubble. Basically, it's a world where everyone agrees with each other all the time, and the idea of someone who genuinely dissents even existing is almost unimaginable.
And because of this bubble, his team figured out a pretty simple formula to get in. All they had to do was use the right buzzwords, act like they were totally on board, and boom. He claims all their defenses just melted away. The thought that they might be talking to a dissenter was, in his words, simply unthinkable.
And Walsh makes a really interesting contrast here. He basically argues that it would be way harder for someone to do the same thing to him because he's not in that kind of bubble. He says he's so used to being challenged that he's always on guard. But he posits that thought leaders like Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, are so insulated that the possibility of an opponent investigating them never even crossed their minds.
So after this whole year-long investigation, what did he actually find? Well, Walsh concluded that the people inside this DEI world fall into two main categories, what he calls the grifters and the guilty.
On one side, you've got the leaders, or the grifters. Walsh paints them as the architects of the whole thing, people motivated by money and power who might not even believe their own message. And then on the other side, you have the followers, the guilty. These are the people in the workshops who seem to be driven by a really genuine sense of guilt and are desperate to find a way to atone for it.
Now for Walsh, the grifters were pretty straightforward, but the followers, they were the ones he found fascinating. Their deep sense of guilt just seems so real, which raised this huge question. Where is all of this guilt actually coming from? And that question is what led Walsh to his central theory for the entire project. It's not just about the DEI movement anymore, but about a fundamental human need he believes it's tapping into. His theory starts with a pretty simple premise. This guilt is real. He argues that while some of it might be for show, after his experiences, like filming a 2-hour race-to-dinner event, he was convinced that for many of these people, the guilt is deeply and genuinely felt. But here's where it gets a little strange, right? Walsh points out that the people feeling this guilt often have no direct, personal connection to historical injustices like slavery or Jim Crow. So if the guilt is real, but it's not tied to their own actions, what is its true source? And this brings us to Walsh's core theory, that this whole ideology is functioning as a substitute for religion.
He argues that it provides a way for a largely secular population to understand and atone for their feelings of guilt.
So let's break down the parallels he's drawing. In a traditional religion, guilt comes from personal sin, and the path to feeling better is through faith, atonement, and forgiveness, with clergy as your guide. Now look at what he calls the white guilt ideology. He argues the guilt here comes from collective wrongs, atonement comes from things like DEI seminars, and your interpreters are activists and consultants whom he labels race hustlers.
Walsh's theory is that people are just naturally going to feel guilt. But if you take a religious framework out of the equation, you create a vacuum. As he puts it, you still got people that are sinning. They're still going to feel the guilt, but they don't have a way of understanding that guilt. And he argues that ideological leaders then step right into that vacuum to provide an explanation.
So when you boil it all down, Walsh's theory is that there's this fundamental human need for a moral structure, a way to find redemption, and that modern political ideologies are rushing in to fill that void.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on. Are modern social movements becoming our new secular religions, complete with their own sins, rituals, and priests? It's a compelling idea to consider. And that's all for this breakdown.